Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org. Hello, podcast listeners. Welcome back. And I'm really excited today to have one of our CESJ board members, Mr. Joe Recinos. Hello, Joe.
How are you doing today?
Great, great. It's an honor to have you with us. Boy, you have had quite an interesting career. From what I understand, not only do you have a political science degree, but you also have worked for a consultant to major organizations like the World Bank and USAID and traveled to many countries. How many countries have you traveled to?
45.
Wow.
Over the last 50 years.
That is amazing. I just can't imagine how educational that would be, because I've been to a few. I've been to some Caribbean countries and Mexico, and we recently went to London, so I went to Europe for the first time. And, just going these places and seeing these things and talking to people, you just learn so much. So I consider you to be a valuable resource, and I look forward to learning from you. Before we get into your very interesting history, and I have to apologize to the listeners, there is more of a delay talking to Joe because he's coming to us from Guatemala. Are you in Guatemala City?
Yes.
Okay, I figured that. Well, I know there'll be a little delay and it'll be frustrating to some people, but it's worth it because, Joe has a lot to say. And before we get into your interesting history, there's an urgent need for knowledge about what's going on in Venezuela. So if someone just tunes in for a few minutes, maybe you can share your opinion about what's going on there before we get into your personal history.
Venezuela has evolved into a socialist dictatorship. When Chavez came to power in the 90s, he wanted to establish a socialist government and a socialist economy. Much further to the left than what exists in different countries in Europe, for example.
Right.
The countries in Europe, you would call them social democrats, really. Even the government of Spain, where the ruling party is the Socialist Party of Spain, it's really a government of social democrats with an emphasis on democracy. When Chavez came to power, he started using oil as a resource, and the price of oil was extremely high. So he started applying socialist concepts of subsidies as a way to resolve the social ills in the country. And of course, that couldn't continue. And when the price of oil dropped, then Venezuela started having significant economic problems. And when the current president took over, Maduro, who became elected through different types of fraud, continued in power, the economy was decimated. Today, for example, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, estimates the inflation rate for the end of this year in Venezuela will be 1 million%.
That's crazy.
1 million%. So what does the government do? It prints money. Every 2 weeks, it raises the wages of employees, government employees, and puts more Venezuelan currency into circulation. As a result, prices continue to skyrocket. There is no produce. You cannot buy food. The country is on the verge of economic collapse. To further complicate matters, Russia and to a lesser degree China see helping the Maduro government as a way to edge on, to goad the U.S. government in different ways. Now, they're there for other reasons. They're there because Venezuela has the highest reserves of oil in the world, even higher than Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
But the Venezuelan government's oil production is constantly going down, because the government mismanages resources, doesn't replace equipment when it's needed. So there are vested interests by Russia and China involved in this. And of course, the United States has looked at Latin America as its own sphere of influence, which is true. So this is one of the reasons why the United States is involved. Of course, it wants to help democracy, wants to help bring a new government to power in Venezuela, overcome the poverty and whatever. But also, it wants to protect this natural oil resource for use by free markets and, of course, by the United States. And there's nothing wrong with that. The United States has to look out for its own welfare. And in the process, it will help bring democracy to Venezuela. Another complicating factor is that many of the people in the military, in the higher echelons of the military, are involved in drug trafficking. This is one of the reasons the high officers in the military do not want to have a new government or a change of regime. That also complicates the situation. What do I foresee for the immediate future? Continued economic collapse. Possibly some of the lower rank officers and some of the lower rank soldiers will get away from supporting the government. You could have an internal group rise up against the government. It could lead to a civil war. The United States will not intervene in any direct way, but they may intervene by providing arms, covert arms, to dissident groups in Venezuela. Unfortunately, that is a hopefully the economic collapse will happen much before that, before you have the beginnings of a civil war. And that in itself could lead to the collapse of the current Maduro government. That's more or less what the situation is right now.
Well, I share your concern for that entire country, and it is so sad to see such potential and vast resources. And from what I understand, in the 90s and late 80s, it was a very civilized, successful place where people were very happy.
It was one of the richest countries in Latin America. Just one point before I forget this. One of CESJ's members, Dr. Norman Bailey, who's now residing in Israel, he knows people in the United States Department of State. He knows the U.S. envoy who was recently appointed by Trump. And it might be worthwhile for Norm Kurland and others, even myself, in touch with Norm Bailey. What we need to do is position ourselves and gain access to the new Venezuelan ambassador to the United States, who's recognized by the U.S. government as a replacement for the Maduro ambassador. He represents the new government of Venezuela, which is vying for control in Venezuela. And it's a question of time. But it might be well worth our while to try to get in touch with different people, so we're positioned. So when the economic collapse occurs and you do have a new government, we can help with introducing broad capital ownership principles in our concepts of binary economics and capital homesteading, and get the ideas to the right people. Right now, we just need to position ourselves. Excuse me for that intervention.
No, absolutely, because that is one of my, extreme, prayers that I have for that country, because our record of sort of exporting the frivolous debt model is not so good in terms of what ends up happening in these countries. Obviously, free market is better than government dictatorship and socialist ownership of industry and things like that. You and I are in total agreement on that, but I think we're also in agreement that what we're trying to do in some of these countries is not always so good either.
One of the concepts that I speak about, Norman and others, that there are four pillars to broaden economic democracy and applying binary economics. Three of them are traditional, based on free market economics, but the fourth is particularly different. Four pillars are: one, limited government; two, access to free and open markets; three, protection of private property, particularly in corporate equity; and the fourth, which makes us different from traditional free market economists or people who advocate free markets, is access to broadened capital ownership. That's the key. So that's right, Dave. Yes, we want free markets to come to Venezuela as we do to the rest of the world. But what's lacking is that fourth pillar, access and to broaden capital ownership as a constitutional right. Very important, as an individual constitutional right.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And, I recently visited Washington, D.C., and I enjoyed talking to you as you had called in. And one of the things that I did while I was there is visited some of the monuments. And I believe it's the one that's around the corner from the Jefferson. It was the George Mason Memorial. And one of the engravings that's real prominent there says that everyone has an inherent natural right to the means of acquiring and possessing property. It was a great quote. It's there on the bench right next to the fellow, and it talks about what he put in the, I believe it was the Virginia Declaration at the time about, very clearly. So it's not just having the freedom to fight your way up from the absolute poverty of the lowest levels of society, but it's also equal access to the mechanisms of capitalism or free markets or whatever you want to call it. So it's not such a new concept to make everybody part of the game, is it?
No, you have to realize that the Virginia Declaration of Rights, George Mason wrote that. The preamble said that all men are created equal. They are endowed with certain inalienable rights: the right to life, liberty, and the ownership of property in order to secure happiness. Jefferson took that very important phrase and put it into the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But he took out the word access to private property in order to secure happiness. Why? Because of the slavery issue.
Right.
Because at that time, slaves were also considered property.
Interesting.
But for an incidence of history, the Declaration of Independence could have, in fact, stated that it would be a right of citizenship to own private property.
Well, that would have been much better, and also have some language about the access to, property, because
yes, but he could have qualified that excluding human beings. But at the time of a Declaration of Independence, the colonies needed the support of the southern colonies where they had slavery. It's unfortunate, but sometimes compromise is necessary.
Right.
It led to the Civil War afterward.
Yep, it did. That's true. But yeah, while we were at that meeting, we had the opportunity to hear you talk about your history and how you came to know about the Just Third Way when you were at college in D.C. Can you share that with our listeners?
Sure. I was studying economics at Georgetown University, and philosophically, I was moving from being an Ayn Rand free market advocate. For those of you who do not know about Ayn Rand, she believes in an extreme concept of individualism, no government intervention whatsoever. In part, it's the philosophy of what we would call in the United States libertarianism in the United States. So I was moving from being an Ayn Rand supporter, moving further toward the left, being influenced by Keynesian economics, which is the prevalent economic philosophy that's applied in the United States. It's sort of a mixture of free market and socialist tendencies that was sponsored by John Maynard Keynes and eventually led to what was called the National Full Employment Act of 1946, that everyone ought to have a job. And if the government had to subsidize that, that's the way you did it. But there was no mention of private property. There's no mention of individual ownership as a way to earn a living. And at the time, of course, the Vietnam War was happening. And I was looking around for a part-time job, and I came across an ad at Georgetown University on the bulletin board of ICES, Institute for the Study of Economic Systems, which was an institute set up by Louis Kelso, Norm Kurland, others like Norman Bailey, to help promote the ideas of broadened capital ownership. So it was sort of I thought the title sounded like some type of government-funded institution. So I thought that if I could work with this institution or whatever they wanted me to do, but I could use part of my time to study. It's sort of like a nice, good socialist mindset.
Right.
So I walked into the office, and Norm Kurland explained to me what they actually did. And within half an hour, I understood the concept about using the corporation as a tool for revolutionary change to broaden the base of capital ownership. So I more or less understood the mechanisms, but the concept was mind-blowing, that the corporation itself, through allowing its employees to acquire equity in ownership, and then spreading the concept to become a national movement, was, in my view, in studying economics, was the key, was the answer. Then, by fortune, I had the opportunity to, I guess, a month later. So Norm Kurland hired me as a file clerk, more or less. But of course, I didn't study on the job. I actually got involved, and afterward, Norm told me, "Look, you're not very good at filing, but forget that. I want you to go out and help me spread the concept." So I had that part-time job while I was still at Georgetown University. But about a month or 2 months later, I happened to meet Louis Kelso, and I heard him speak at a college editors conference. This is a conference of the editors of college newspapers from around the United States. And they had a conference, a debate between Louis Kelso and his concept of broadened ownership. And at that time, what we called it two-factor economics. The owner of that a person can earn a living through the ownership of capital and also through traditional manual labor. And the first person who got up to speak was the editor of the Socialist Workers newspaper. And he gave his traditional speech on socialism. Then Louis Kelso gave a rebuttal as a lawyer and just tore the argument apart. So much so that the editor couldn't reply. He like he'd been hit with a sledgehammer.
Oh, I would love to hear a recording of that.
Yes. So it was. So I heard a very scholarly presentation by Lewis against traditional, in this instance, socialist arguments. So I was totally convinced. So that's more or less how I got to meet Norman. Then continued to work with him in Washington. Then I went to Guatemala afterward and got involved in other different ways to introduce broadened ownership. And we'll discuss that in some of the other questions.
Right. Well, it's really amazing that you spent so little time in the United States because you speak better English than I do.
Well, my English was my first language, not Spanish.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you
I was
about that.
born. I was born in Guatemala, but I left when I was 1 year old. 1 year, and my mother was born in North Carolina. And my father was Guatemalan, so my mother always wanted to speak in English, not in Spanish. So I learned Spanish as a second language through high school, through college, and then being back in Latin America.
Well, that's interesting because I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think I had mentioned to you I have a friend here in Atlanta from Guatemala, and apparently as a child he spoke a native language there. Then he had to learn Spanish to get a job in Mexico, and eventually English to come to the United States. So I mean, it was a very long, difficult process for him, and somebody like that appreciates the opportunity to work here in the United States and went through all of that effort to do so. As you can imagine, he's one of the hardest working people I know. But I was curious to know if that was your experience, or does most of your family speak a native language there?
No, Spanish.
Okay.
60%, 60 to 70% of the population in Guatemala speak Indian languages. There are 5 Indian groups and 25 dialects.
Wow, I don't think many people realize that.
Yes, that's about 60% of the population. But you have to learn Spanish in order to progress. And it's also, once you know Spanish and people try to learn English, it's more difficult than the reverse. If you speak English, it's much easier. It may not seem that way, but it's much easier to learn Spanish, for example. Why is this? Because English is an irregular language. The verbs are irregular. The words are not pronounced as they are written. So if you're and Spanish is much more methodical as a Romance language. It has grammatical rules that are followed, and what is written is pronounced in the same way. So I understand how difficult it can be for someone who just speaks Spanish and wants to learn English. It is more difficult than the reverse. Now, I know people in the United States may say, oh, but it's very difficult to learn a foreign language. I assure them it's much more difficult for someone who speaks a foreign language to learn English.
Yes, and I agree. There's so many, exceptions. Like you say, Spanish follows more of a rule. And, with English, there's so many words that don't conform to the overall scheme of things. It's just strange.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, okay, so you were in DC. I get the feeling that you were sort of in the right place at the right time when the whole like Reagan, administration was trying to influence Central America, and Reagan was actually in favor of widespread ownership more than just about any other, executive in any position in the United States really ever has been. So I bet that was quite, like you had mentioned, that was exciting. You felt like something was really going to happen, right?
Correct. In Central America, there's an economic concept called Solidarismo, solidarity. It's an economic philosophy that philosophically has a lot in common with broadened capital ownership as advocated by Louis Kelso. The founder of this concept was named Alberto Martin. He was one of the founders of the modern Costa Rican government with Jose Figueres. He's a lawyer, and he brought about a concept of broadened capital ownership. And he first tried to introduce this into different companies. And what he wanted to do was set up solidarity worker associations in each company, where the worker would put in 5% of his salary, and the company would match that as an advance on severance pay. Severance pay in Latin America is a company obligation. It's similar to unemployment insurance in the United States, but in Latin America, it's a company obligation, not a government obligation. So that money is used to promote credit co-ops, purchase of equipment, food, and then in many cases, these associations acquire equity in the parent corporation. So in Costa Rica, it's well developed. There are about 2,700 companies that apply this, and many companies have sold shares to their worker associations. It varies from 10 to 20% of equity. It's not binary economics, but it's moving in the same direction. And
Right.
Martin was a friend of Louis Kelso. I asked Louis Kelso many years ago if he knew Alberto Martin. He said, yes, he and I have been writing to each other since the 1950s. And
Wow.
I thought that was fabulous. The common minds come together on common ideas. And remember, this is the 1950s. I mean, you had to communicate by mail, snail mail.
Right. How about that?
But it was rather fascinating. In any event, in Guatemala, I and other people here in Guatemala looked at the solidarity movement as a way to introduce broadened capital ownership.
Sure.
Wanted to gain support from the private sector and from the workers. So a large coffee estate in part of the highlands of Guatemala called La Perla, the owners wanted to introduce and set up this employee association. And from the outset, they wanted the employee association, representing about 300 workers, to own about 40% of the shares of the estate. Why would they do this? Well, apart from just liking the idea, they viewed this as a way to combat the growing Marxist insurgency in the area. Neighboring farms had been burned out. You had cadres from Cuba helping Marxist revolutionaries to try to take over the country in Guatemala. This was the beginning of what eventually would become a 36-year civil war that started in 1970 and finished in 1996. Over 200,000 people were killed. 1 million people were displaced to southern Mexico. Friends of mine whom I knew, were killed on the far left, by the far left and by the far right. What the insurgency wanted to do was eliminate people in the middle, moderates who are looking for common solutions. So the owners of La Finca La Perla set up a solidarity association. And then through personal contacts, through a very dear close friend, former U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica, Curtin Windsor, who supported the idea of Solidarismo, he introduced me to people in Washington. I eventually, through Norman Kurland, we got the support for a presidential task force to introduce broadened capital ownership principles into Central America. We had the support of people, for example, from a person called Michael Barnes. He was a left member of the Democratic Party at the time, and this is in the 1980s.
I think he became a television commentator later.
I didn't know that. Okay. Well, anyway, he supported the idea. And then we got people like Philip Crane and the senator who recently died, Richard Lugard, who also became a supporter. So we had a list of people on the right and on the left in the Senate and in the House of Representatives who supported the idea. And eventually we got the okay to set up the Presidential Task Force on Economic Justice and proceeded to visit different countries in Central America and then write a report. That report is available through CESJ, and it's dedicated to the workers of La Finca La Perla, of the coffee estate La Perla. They actually set up their own civil defense patrol to defend the estate against the Marxists.
And I do remember in one of Reagan's speeches, I think he mentioned that during the Civil War, they were trying to fight to save that company and the property around it and keep it structured as it was. They were willing to die for it. That's how dedicated they were to the success, that they had experienced in widespread ownership.
Correct. And a reporter from the Wall Street Journal a few years later went down to visit the estate, and I went with her. And she asked one of these peasants, who could not read or write, what did this idea of ownership mean to you? And he said, well, eventually, you see that coffee plant? I'm going to own part of that. That's his concept, property. He didn't understand the idea of stock ownership or shares owned by the association, but he understood that coffee plant was going to be part his. That's how the concept translates for peasants. And
right.
And when they formed the Solidarity Association, and they're talking about different kind of ownership projects, the person who helped formed it asked a peasant who couldn't read or write, he was going to put a cross mark on a paper to help form this worker association. He asked him, but you don't know how to read or write. Are you sure you want to sign this document? And he said, I don't know how to read or write, but I do know how to think. And this is good for me, and it's good for my family, and it's good for the country.
Wow.
That kind of concept, when you talk to peasants, even though they are, in our terminology, they're illiterate, they understand where power comes from. As Louis Kelso used to say, when he talks about binary economics and broad capital ownership, ultimately what we're doing is looking at the concept of power and control. Yes, you're going to get a stable income from the ownership of your shares, but it's more than that. It's a question of power, and that's the reason you have groups opposed to what we are trying to do through CESJ.
Right.
Because we're trying to diffuse power, to have more people have ownership as a way to acquire power and control over their own lives.
It's like Norm says, we want to pulverize power.
Yes, that's a good idea. And of course, that's one of the reasons that some groups, unfortunately, who have political and economic power don't want this to happen. Years ago, Louis Kelso told me about a possible supporter of broadened capital ownership. This is through ISIS. This is in the 70s. The owner of one of the heirs of the GM automotive fortune was named Stuart Mott, M-O-T-T. And he had a foundation, a liberal foundation. And Louis Kelso went to him and explained the idea of binary economics, of broad capital ownership, and the principles to broaden ownership. And Henry Mott said, your ideas are on target. If they could actually be applied in the United States, but I'm not going to help you. And Louis Kelso, perplexed, asked him, well, why won't you help me? Why won't you make a donation to help us get this idea circulated? Says, because I like the idea of having a foundation and being able to give money to people. What he was saying is that he liked the idea of being in a position of a power elite. So, in the United States today, we have people on the right and on the left who believe in the control of power. That's where socialists come in. The socialists are no different from the far right.
Right.
It's controlling power through the ownership of assets. And we are offering a different paradigm. That's extremely important.
Join us next week for part 2 of the conversation with Joe Recinos.
You can join CESJ by going to cesj.org and clicking on participate, and you can become a paying member for $25 per year, and also a student membership is $15 per year, and that qualifies you for discounts on our materials such as books, which you can buy many of and distribute to your friends and family. And also, if you'd like to participate and comment on the podcast, feel free to call. I have a voicemail set up. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll play it on the podcast. The number is 678-719-2840. Own or be owned.